Labeling a map increases its usefulness to the map reader, if the labels are done well. The Salem downtown map labels are decent for as little work that we put into labeling the features. However, the map labels are far from publishable quality. In this task, we will teach you how to use the data-defined overrides to improve placement, define different labeling properties for records of different types, and hide labels, among other things. First, let's determine what a data-defined override is and how to identify where they can be set. A data-defined override sets a layer property to a value stored in an attribute field in the layer. So for example, a layer's label font, style, size, size unit, and color can all be set by referencing attribute values for the layer that is being labeled. And so each text property, and let me show that to you here, going to the label properties, here we go. So each text property that can be set with a data-defined override will have this button, so the one I'm pointing to right here, beside the property. And so you can see that here we have scale-based visibility, the minimum and the maximum, and the pixel-sized visibility can be set. If I go to text, we can set the font, the style, the strike-through, the size, whether the size unit, the color, and so on. So there's a lot of properties that we can have set in the attribute table using these data-defined overrides. And they're not just in label properties either. You'll find these data-defined override buttons many places in Qgis. So to set an override, what you do is you click the override button and then choose field type, and then you choose which field you want to reference as the override. And so that's the value that it's going to read to set that particular property. To get a description of what each data-defined override does, the expected input, valid input types, and current definition, if you click the override button and then choose description, you get a nice box here that lets you know what is expected for this data-defined override. Okay, so if we look at, say, the font override, there we go, it expects a string input that contains the font family name. Additionally, it only accepts a string field. Now other properties may accept multiple field formats, but this one's going to accept string only. So therefore, if we wish to have our record labeled using the Arial font family, we would create a field name font of format string and store the string Arial in the field for the record we want to label. So, with that background information explained, let's start with moving the South River label to a more reasonable location. So again, you can see it's really crowding this street here, and we want to move that over. So to do that, we're going to take 3 steps. Step 1 is to create an attribute column to store the label's x-coordinate, y-coordinate, and rotation value. So that's 3 columns, one for each one of those values. Step 2 is to assign the attributes created in Step 1 to data-defined overrides. So that's where we connect it to the labeling properties. And then in Step 3, we're going to start editing the layer, and then we're going to use the Move Label and Rotate Label buttons on the Label toolbar to modify the South River label. And so let's do that now. And so I'm going to open up the Label properties for the Waterways layer. I'm going to choose the Placement tab, and note that in the data defined section for coordinate x and y, so data defined section, notice that for coordinate x, y, and rotation, these can all be set with data defined overrides. And the reason why I know that is because they all 3 have these override buttons. So let's take a look at the data defined override description for the x and the y. And let's pay special attention to the valid input types. So let's see here. Valid input types, we have string, integer, and double. Okay, so that's for the x. Let's take a look at the y. It's the same. And let's also take a look at rotation. Again, string, integer, and double. But also notice the expected input here is a double between -180 and +180. So now we know what our domain is. Okay, so let's close the label properties and let's create those fields for the x position, y position, and rotation. So to do that, I'm going to open up the attribute table of waterways. And there's multiple ways to create attribute fields, by the way. This is just one of them. And I'm going to start editing. And I'm going to add a new column. And I'm going to name it label X. And I'm going to give it a comment. So for instance, X location of label. For the type, I'm going to choose decimal number. For the width, I'm going to choose 9, and for the precision, I'm going to choose 6 because this is storing a coordinate. And so since I'm working in WGS 84, latitude and longitude, I want to make sure I go to the 6th decimal place so that I have the maximum amount of precision when I'm locating this label. I'm going to click OK. Now I'm going to create a second column for label Y. And so this is Y coordinate of label. Same thing, decimal, with 9 and 6 width and precision respectively. Now I'm going to create a third column. I'm going to call this one, let's go label rota, since that's all it'll take. So this is labels rotation value. And so for this one, I'm going to do a whole number because I think the nearest degree would be fine. And so I'm going to do width 3 though, so that way I can store positive and negative 180. So now I'm going to stop editing and save my edits. So now with the proper fields created, we're going to link them to the data defined overrides. So I'm going to close the attribute table here. I'm going to reopen the label properties for the waterway label layer. I'm going to click on the placement tab, and I'm going to scroll down to the data defined for coordinate X. I'm going to click the button, choose field type, and I'm going to choose label X. And you know that it's connected when it has a yellow fill color, and when I scroll down you can see that label X is checked. So I'm going to set the data defined override for the Y and for the rotation. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to click OK, and it's going to set those data defined overrides. So now we can do the final step, which is editing the label's placement. So to do that, we have to make sure the labeling toolbar is turned on, and that's this toolbar here. If it's not turned on for you, you can right click somewhere on an empty toolbar and make sure that label is selected. So let me turn it off and then turn it back on so you can more clearly see which toolbar it is. So let's take a moment to explore the toolbar. So first let me start editing so I can activate some of the options. And what we have first is the labeling options. This opens a dialog box allowing you to change the label properties. Next we have the highlight pin labels. So any labels that have been modified and have values stored in the data defined overrides attribute field is considered to be pinned. Pin labels will be highlighted when this button is toggled on, and you'll see this what this does here in a little bit. Then you have pin unpin labels. With this button toggled on, if you click a label, it will become or stay pinned. If you hold the Shift key on your keyboard and click a pinned label, the data defined override values will be erased and the label will no longer be pinned, and it will return to its original location. Here we have the ShowHide Labels button, which is currently disabled. And with this button toggled on, if you click a label, it will become invisible. Shift clicking a label will make it visible again. Here we have the Move Label button. This allows you to click and drag a label to define a new location. It will store those values in the data defined override fields. This is the Rotate Label button that allows you to click and drag to rotate a label. Holding the Control key on your keyboard while rotating will rotate the label in 15-degree increments. Here's the Change Label button. This allows you to change the text of the label and any data-defined override values you have enabled. So we will use the Move and Rotate commands to move the South River label to a more desirable location. So I'm going to click on the Move Label button to enable the command. Then I'm going to click on the South River label and I'm going to move it. So I'm going to move it, say, over here. So you can see that it successfully moved. So now I need to rotate it to the rotation value that I desire. So I'm going to make it roughly parallel with the river. So I'm going to click the Rotate Label button, and I'm going to click and I'm going to drag it, there we go, until I get to where I'm generally happy with the rotation. Maybe up just a little bit, maybe 5. That looks pretty good. So now I'm going to save my edits by stopping editing and clicking Save. And I'm going to now open the Waterways Attribute table to see what happened. And so notice for label X, label Y, and label rotation, it has stored the values. So at this point, I could add Waterways layer to another Qgis project, enable labeling on the name field, and enable data-defined overrides using the 3 fields created in this task to have the label show up in the exact location I just set. If I use the Waterways layer in another Qgis project and do not enable data-defined overrides, then the Waterways layer will be labeled using the basic labeling engine. So now let's turn our attention to the natural layer, which represents parks in downtown Salem. Note that multiple park labels are wider than the park. To help mitigate this, let's do 3 things. 1. Define a data-defined override for the position of the label. 2. Define a font size for the label. And 3. Wrap the text to a new line based on specific characters in the text. So using what we learned above, I'm going to create attributes and define the data-defined overrides for the X and Y position of the natural labels. Okay, so you can see I've done that. So if I look at the data-defined override for X and Y, you see I have a label X field and I have a label Y field. So now I'm going to create the field for the font size. So to do that, I'm going to click New Field while I'm editing. I'm going to give it a name of L font size. For the comment, I'm going to say labels, font size, and points. For the type, it's going to be decimal number, real, and the width of 3, and the precision of 1, allowing me for 1/10 of a point size. Click OK. Now I'm going to set the value for all of them to 9.0. So I'm going to open the field calculator, click Update Existing Field, choose L font size, and for the expression I'm going to put 9.0. I'm going to click OK, and you can see now they're all set to 9.0. I'm going to stop editing. Now I'm going to open up the label properties for the natural layer. I'm going to click on the Text tab, and for the size I'm going to set the data-defined override to L font size. So I'm going to make sure, there we go, and it's yellow. So I have that set. So now when I click OK, the map is going to look the same because the natural layer is already labeled with a size of 9.0 point labels. But if we want to change those individually or all together, we now have a data-defined override set up for that. So before we change label sizes of individual parks, let's set up the text wrapping so we can change both the font size and label wrap at once later. So I'm going to reopen the label properties for the natural layer, going to select the Formatting tab, and on the Set Wrap on Character, I'm going to put \n. And so this property should look familiar to some programmers. The \n character sequence is a common way to denote that a carriage return and line feed should be inserted at that location in a string of text. We're going to use this sequence to identify locations in the label text where the label should continue on the next line. So with the font size and wrap on text properties set, let's change the park's label to see how they work. So I'm going to click OK to close the natural layer's properties. I'm going to start editing on the natural layer, and on the labels toolbar I'm going to click the Change Label button. With that selected, I'm going to click on the Lappin Park label here, and that brings up the Label Properties dialog box. I'm going to change the following label properties. For the text, I'm going to delete the space between Lappin and Park and put \n. For the font, I'm going to change that to size of 7.0. And so with those two properties set, I'm going to click OK. And now you can see that Lapin Park has become smaller, and now it's split on 2 lines. So lastly, I'm going to move it to a more desirable location to where it's right on top of the park. There we go. That looks pretty good there. Tweak it just a little bit. Okay, so using your judgment, you will need to change the Armory Park, the 15 Peabody Street Park, and the High Street Park labels to where they're more desirable. I'm going to do that now. And so that's my modified park labels. So I'm going to stop editing so that I save my choices. So with the waterways and parks labeled, all that's left to label are the roads. To properly label the roads, we will use a data-defined override value for the position, rotation, visibility, font color, and font size. Additionally, we will wrap the text on the \n characters. So let's get started. So using what we learned above, for the roads layer, we're going to create attributes and data-defined overrides for the following: X and Y position, rotation value, and font size. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, and so I now have label X, label Y, and label rotate field. So now I'm going to set the wrap property to \n, again by opening the label properties, choosing formatting, and putting \n as the wrap on character. And now I'm going to create a new attribute with the following properties. So for this one, I'm going to click on Fields, and I'm going to click on New. And for the name here is going to be L Visibility. The comment is Labels Visibility. And the type is going to be a whole number of integer, and the width is going to be 1. Okay, and so I want to set all of the values of visibility to 1. So because 1 is going to represent true. In fact, let me show you the properties real quick of the visible. So if I go to Labels and I click on Rendering, under Show Label, this is the data-defined override we're going to be setting. Notice that the expected input is a Boolean value, 1 equaling true and 0 equaling false, and it accepts integers, which is what I set it to. So I'm going to set the visibility of all roads to 1 by default. So to do that, I'm going to use the field calculator. I'm going to update an existing field, that existing field being L visibility, and the expression should be the number 1, the Boolean value 1. And now when we attach this data-defined override, they will all be set to 1 and the labels will all be visible. Okay, so now we're going to set the data-defined overrides. So I'm going to go to Placement, and I'm going to set the data-defined override for X, Y, rotation, and then for the visibility, that's in the Rendering tab, and under Show Label, that is going to point to L visibility. And I'm going to click OK. To show or hide a label, you will start editing the layer. Then, on the label toolbar, click the ShowHide Label button, this one here. To show a label, you click on it. To hide a label, you shift-click on it. So for instance, if I want to hide Church Street, I will shift-click Church Street, and it is hidden. So that sets 0 in the data-defined override attribute. To bring it back, I'll just click on it. Hopefully, there we go, and it'll come back. Okay, so now let's create a new attribute with the following properties so we can set the label's font value in a data-defined override. So to do that, I'm going to open up the attribute table. I'm going to create a new attribute field, and we're going to name this one Label Font, and the comment is Labels Font. This is going to be a string or text, and for the width here, I'm going to go with 10. I don't think I'm going to need much more than that. Now I'm going to set every record to Arial, since I want the font for all of them to be Arial. So to do that, I'm going to open up the field calculator, update the existing field of label font, and I'm going to type in single quote Arial single quote, since it is a string. going to click OK, and you can see they are now all Arial. Now let's attach the data defined override. So I'm going to go back to the label properties. I'm going to click on the text tab, and for the font, I'm going to set the field to label font. OK, I'm going to click OK, and now it's going to look the same though because everything was already labeled in Arial. So the last labeling option we're going to set is the data defined override for the font color. This override needs a short explanation on how values should be stored in the attribute. So first, let's look at the data defined description of the color property. So I'm going to open up the label properties. For the color, I'm going to click the data defined, click description. So for the expected input, it's a list of 3 values: red, green, and blue. And each value should range between the numbers 0 and 255. The attribute field should be of type text. So as an example, to specify the color white, we would store in the attribute this string, 255, 255, 255. And for black, the value would be 0, 0, 0. So what we need to figure out is what is the maximum number of characters that we would need to hold in our new attribute field. Well, since white uses the maximum value of 255 for red, green, and blue, we can count 11 characters, so that's 9 numbers plus 2 commas, and that's going to be the maximum width of that field. So with that sorted, let's create the attribute field to hold the label color. So I'm going to click on the, I'm going to click OK. I'm going to open the attribute table once again for roads, and I'm going to create a new attribute field, and I'm going to name this one label color. Labels RGB color is going to be the comment. For the type, I'm going to choose string, and that width is going to be 11. Again, 255 3 times plus 2 commas. I'm going to click OK. And so for this field, we could set different font colors for the records. However, in our case, we're going to leave the values as null for now, as the black color set in the label properties will display if we see a null value in the data defined override field, as we do here. So now we need to set the data defined override for the font color. So again, I'm going to open up the label properties, click on text, and for color, I'm going to choose the label color field. So let's set the roads with the type attribute of footway, path, pedestrian, or track to a different color from the roads. So if we look right now, you can see that all the fonts for the roads are all the same, even the tracks right here, which is the kind of the thin gray line. And so to do that, so just to set those font colors to be different, let's do this. So we're going to open the attribute table. I'm going to click the Select Features button. So we're going to select it using an expression. And I'm going to set the following expression. So I'm going to say where the field of type equals, and I'm going to load all unique values. I'm going to choose footway. And so I want to say or type equals path, or, I'm typing in or in the keyboard, but you could also come up and find it up here in one of the operators, I believe. It's just a Boolean operator. Or type equals pedestrian, or type equals track. Oops, I have 2 equal signs there. Let me get rid of one. And now I'm going to click select, and it's going to select for me 26 records, and I know that because at the top it says selected 26. Alright, so with that done, now I'm going to make sure I'm editing. I'm going to scroll over to the label color just to make sure that everything is there and exists. And I'm going to click the field calculator, and I'm going to set the following values. I'm going to first make sure only update selected features is checked. I'm going to update an existing field, and that field is going to be label color. So for the expression, I'm going to set the value of, single quote, because I'm working with a string here, 75, comma, 67, comma, 64. This is a color that I'd chosen previously. I'm going to click OK, and you can see that it set the value of all the selected records to that value. So I'm going to say show only selected features, so you can see that all the selected features now have that value. Okay, so let's stop editing. Let's save our edits. Let me close my attribute table. Okay, and let me deselect all of the features. So let's do that here. And now you can see that our pathway and our path, footway, pedestrian, and track labels are all this light gray color. So let me zoom in a little closer so you can see that. How about here? So you can see the different colored labels. Okay, so that's it for this task. So I'm going to save the Qgis project.